A man who hammers nails at 4 in the morning to keep the wolves away, but lets his own daughter grow cold inside the very house he's fighting to save. What happens when a 7-year-old girl speaks the one truth a giant cannot outrun? Stay with me. This story will break you and put you back together. Like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a single word.
4:47 in the morning, 18 degrees. Elias Thorne swung the hammer. It was a heavy iron thing, but in his massive hand it looked like a toy. He drove a thick square nail through the warped siding of the barn. Frost splintered off the wood like broken glass. The cold bit into his scarred knuckles, but he didn't stop. He could inside the main house. 50 yards away, a cast-iron skillet clattered hard against the stove. Elias froze. The hammer hovered midair, his breath plumed in the biting wind. A thick white cloud in the bruised purple light of the Texas dawn. He listened. Abby. She was 7 years old, too small to be hauling cast iron, too young to be dragging a heavy wooden stool across the floorboards just to reach the coffee grinder. But there she was. A few minutes later, the sharp, bitter smell of scorched oats drifted out the chimney and across the frozen yard. She hadn't learned how to manage the stove's damper yet. Elias lowered the hammer. He looked at the frosted kitchen window. Through the glass, the warm, amber glow of an oil lamp framed her tiny silhouette. He should go in. He should take the heavy spoon from her hand, pull the pot off the fire, and look his daughter. He should tell her good morning. He gripped the hammer tighter, turned back to the barn, swung again. He told himself he was doing what a man had to do. He worked 18-hour days to keep this place breathing. He made sure she had the thickest wool boots in Kerrville. He was out here in the freezing dark, so the cattle wouldn't die, so he could pay the bank, so she would have a roof over her head. He was a provider, a shield against the harsh world, but a man can provide and still fail. Every time Elias looked at Abby, he saw Sarah, the same dark, quiet eyes, the same stubborn tilt of the chin. Looking at his daughter was like staring directly into the blazing sun of his own grief. So, he looked away. He kept her fed, he kept her clothed, but he left her utterly alone in that house. It was a quiet, unintentional kind of cruelty. He was saving the ranch, but he was starving his child of a father, and the ranch was slipping away anyway. March 1st, 45 days, that was the deadline. Silas Mercer down at the Kerrville Bank wasn't a malicious man. He was just a man with ledgers, and ledgers don't care about a widower's grief. The ink was dry, $1,847. To wring that kind of money out of the frozen Texas earth, Elias needed to be out in the pastures from sunup to sundown. He couldn't do that if he was tending the stove. He needed help in the house, someone to watch Abby, someone to stop the oats from burning. But nobody wanted to work at the Thorne Ranch. It wasn't the pay. It was the smell of ruin. Folks in town knew a sinking ship when they saw one. 3 women had already turned him down. I don't want to learn a new kitchen just to get evicted next month, Elias. He couldn't even get mad at them. They were right by noon. The wind had teeth. Elias rode his gelding into Kerrville for nails and a sack of flour. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside the mercantile. He kept his head down, the brim of his Stetson pulled low. He didn't have the energy for the pitying nods from the locals. He didn't want to see the whispers behind gloved hands. He stepped onto the wooden porch. The boards groaned under his boots. That S when he saw it. A single piece of paper tacked dead center on the community board. It wasn't the paper itself that caught his eye. It was the handwriting. It didn't look like the frantic, slanted scrawl of someone begging for a scrap of work. It was sharp, deliberate. The ink was pressed into the page with steady, unapologetic authority. Employment required, domestic management, cooking, childcare. Experience. Wage negotiable. Inquire for Clara Vance, room 3, a boarding house. Serious inquiries only. No pleas, no desperation, no flowery words asking for charity. Elias stared at the notice. In a town full of people quietly waiting for him to fail, here was a woman demanding to be taken seriously. He reached up with a bruised, calloused hand. He pulled the pin, folded the heavy paper, and slipped it into his coat pocket. For the first time in 2 years, the giant rancher felt something besides the cold. Marcy's boarding house smelled of lye soap, stale pipe tobacco, and boiled cabbage. Elias stood in the narrow parlor. He felt too big for the room. His broad shoulders blocked the light from the single frosted window. He held his Stetson in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He didn't want to be here. He was a man used to the open sky. Walls made him restless. Needing help made him feel small. He expected a weeping widow. That's what the frontier usually made of women left alone. He expected downcast eyes, a trembling voice. He expected someone who would take whatever scrap he offered, because starvation was waiting on the porch. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, even, measured, unhurried. Clara Vance walked into the parlor. Elias stopped turning his hat. She wasn't trembling. She wore a dark, heavy wool dress, mended at the elbows but pressed sharp. Her hair was pulled back tight. No nonsense, but it was her eyes that caught him. They were the color of riverstone, steady, calculating, looking right at him, not at his boots. She didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't wait for permission. She walked straight up to him and held out her hand. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Clara Vance." Elias stared at her hand. Women in Kerrville didn't shake hands like that. They nodded, they curtsied, they held their hands in front of them like they were guarding something. Clara Vance was offering her hand like a cattle buyer, closing a deal. He took it. Her grip was firm, calloused, real. "Elias Thorne," he said. His voice was a deep rumble in the small room. "Please, sit." She pointed to a stiff-backed armchair. She took the chair opposite him. She didn't perch on the edge. She sat back, settled, ready. "I saw your paper," Elias said. He felt clumsy. He cleared his throat. "Down at the Mercantile, I have a ranch 7 miles out. It's a working place. Not a holiday. I have a daughter, 7 years old." "Abigail," Clara said. Elias said, blinked. "You know her?" "I asked around," Clara said smoothly. "A woman doesn't answer a blind notice without knowing the terrain. Your wife passed 2 years ago. Typhoid. You run 100 head of cattle, mostly on your own. You owe the Kerrville Bank." She paused. "Just a second. And you are desperate for hands." Elias tightened his jaw. He didn't like his life laid bare by a stranger. "I need someone to manage the house, cook, keep an eye on the girl. It ain't glamorous work." "I am not looking for glamour, Mr. Thorne. I am looking for employment." Elias nodded. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. He figured he held the cards now, the money cards. "Standard wage around here is $12 a month. Times are lean. I can offer you, you'll have a room, food, a roof that mostly doesn't leak." He waited for the sigh, the reluctant nod, the submission. Clara looked at him. The Riverstone eyes didn't blink. $6 a month," she said. Elias stopped breathing for a second. He frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together. "Excuse me?" "$6," Clara repeated. Her voice was flat, calm. "Ma'am, folks usually haggle the other way. You misheard me. I said 8. I heard you perfectly, Mr. Thorne." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "I will take 6, but there are conditions attached to that discount." Elias leaned back. The wood of the chair groaned under his weight. "Conditions? Yes." She didn't flinch under his massive shadow. "I am selling my labor, Mr. Thorne. My organizational skills, the sweat of my brow. I am not selling my dignity." She leaned forward now, closing the distance. "I require a quiet place to root my life. I will take less money, but in exchange I demand absolute autonomy in my kitchen. You will not tell me how to cook. You will not tell me how to clean. I will not be treated as a subordinate to be yelled at when the weather turns sour or the cattle stray. We will speak to each other as equals under that roof. Do we have an agreement?" The room went dead quiet. Elias stared at her. He had never heard a woman talk like this. Not his mother, not even Sarah. God rest her. Women out here asked for protection. They asked for provision. Clara Vance was demanding respect. She was looking him dead in the eye, offering a lifeline, but refusing to let him hold the leash. It was an education in human worth, delivered in a quiet, unshakable voice. She wasn't an amplified root for bread. She was a partner offering a trade. Elias looked at her hands. He looked at the sharp set of her jaw. He didn't know what she was running from. He didn't know why she needed the quiet so badly she cut her own wage to get it, but he knew one thing: she wouldn't break under the weight of the Thorne Ranch. Elias stood up. The room seemed to shrink again. He reached out his massive hand. $6, Elias said, "and the kitchen is yours." Clara stood. She took his hand, another firm shake. "I'll have my trunk ready in an hour," she said. Elias walked out of Marcy's boarding house. The wind hit him in the face, cold and sharp, but for a moment the heavy, frozen weight sitting on his chest felt just a fraction lighter. He hadn't just hired a cook. He had just made a contract with an equal. The adaptation was completely silent. Elias had braced himself for chaos, for questions, for the clatter of a stranger breaking the fragile, frozen routine he had built around his grief. Instead, Clara Vance simply slipped into the spaces he had left empty. She didn't ask where the flour was. She found it. She didn't ask what time he wanted breakfast. On her first morning, he walked into the kitchen at 5 o'clock to find a plate of hot eggs and thick-cut bacon waiting. The coffee was black, strong, and didn't taste like burnt ashes. She didn't hover. She didn't wait for a thank you. She was already outside feeding the chickens, treating the house like a machine she had been hired to oil and maintain. It wasn't servitude. Elias recognized the difference immediately. A servant waits for orders. Clara operated with the quiet authority of a manager. By the 4th day, Elias walked into the kitchen after checking the fences. His boots were muddy. He kicked them off at the door. He walked to the oak table where he kept his ledgers. The heavy leather-bound book was his lifeblood, his doom. No one touched the ledger. He stopped. The ledger was closed. sitting squarely in the center of the table. A small slip of white paper stuck out from the pages. Elias frowned. He opened the book to the mark he had been staring at for weeks, trying to figure out why the feed numbers didn't match the bank draft. In the margin, written in sharp blue ink, was a single note. Column 3, row 7. Transpose the 4 and the 9. You are $23 to the good. Elias stared at the numbers. He did the math in his head. She was right. He looked up. Clara was by the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She didn't turn around. She didn't seek his praise. She had simply seen a problem, fixed it, and moved on. It was an implicit stroke of equality. She hadn't dumbed herself down. She hadn't pretended not to understand numbers to protect his pride. She treated him like a man who valued truth. Ego. Elias slowly closed the book. He didn't say anything, but the respect in his chest took deep root. If Clara's relationship with Elias was built on silent competence, her relationship with Abby was built on silent observation. Clara didn't rush the child. She didn't coo. She didn't force smiles or ask 100 questions. She just let Abby be. But she left spaces for the girl to step into. A spare bowl of peas that needed shelling. A ball of yarn that needed winding. By the second week, Abby was trailing Clara like a quiet little shadow. It all came to a head on a bitter Sunday afternoon. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window panes. Inside, the fire was roaring. Elias sat in the corner of the parlor. His massive frame was hunched over his Winchester rifle. He had a rag soaked in gun oil in one hand, an iron cleaning rod in the other. He rubbed the walnut stock rhythmically, back and forth, focusing on the wood, the metal, the smell of the oil, focusing on anything but the people in the room. Clara sat at the kitchen table. She had a mending basket in front of her. Abby sat beside Clara. The little girl had a needle threaded with clumsy, thick red yarn. She was trying to stitch a torn piece of canvas. Her brow was furrowed in intense concentration. She bit her bottom lip. It looked like a family. If a stranger looked through the frosted window, they would see a father, a mother, and a child keeping warm against the storm. But Elias wasn't in the room. Not really. He was miles away, trapped in his own head, calculating the price of beef, the cost of hay, the crushing weight of Silas Mercer's mortgage. He was protecting them. That's what he told himself. He was the wall between this warm room and the frozen ruin outside. Look, Abby said softly. Elias didn't look up. He kept rubbing the rifle stock. Look, Miss Clara, Abby said, a little louder. I see it, Abby Clara. S' voice was warm. Real. Your stitches are getting tighter. You hold the needle very well. Abby smiled. It was a small, fragile thing. She slid off the chair. She walked over to the corner where the giant rancher sat in his cloud of gun oil. She stood beside his knee. She held up the piece of canvas. Look, Papa, Abby said. Elias didn't stop moving the rag. He didn't turn his head. He didn't want to look at those eyes. Sarah's eyes, busy, Abby, Elias grunted. His voice was a low rumble. I fixed the hole, she said, holding it closer. That's nice. Go show Miss Clara. Papa has to clean the rifle. I already showed her. Abby's voice trembled. Just a fraction. I want to show you. Abby. Elias sighed, a heavy, impatient sound. He kept his eyes fixed on the metal barrel. I don't have time right now. I have to finish this so I can check the south fence before dark. Go sit down. He didn't mean to be cruel. He thought he was teaching her about work, about responsibility. The room went dead silent. The crackle of the fire sounded loud as a gunshot. Abby didn't move. She lowered the canvas, her small fists clenched at her sides. Elias finally stopped rubbing the gun. The silence was too heavy. He turned his head slowly, looking down at his daughter. Abby wasn't crying. Her chin was tipped up. Her dark eyes, those eyes that tore him apart, were fixed on his face. There was an ancient, exhausted understanding in them. An understanding no 7-year-old should possess. You need a wife, the little girl said. Her voice wasn't a tantrum. It was a flat, devastating statement of fact. You need a wife to clean up. You need someone to make the food and wash the floor so you can go look at your fences. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. Abby didn't blink. And I need a dad. Miss Clara needs a family. Why are you pretending that working yourself to death is enough? The words hung in the air, heavy, sharp, ringing with absolute, unbreakable truth. The giant rancher froze. The oily rag slipped from Elias's thick fingers. It hit the floorboards with a soft, dull thud. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the room seemed to rush inward. He stared at his little girl, really stared at her. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't see Sarah's ghost. He saw Abigail. He saw a child who had been living in an emotional winter far colder than the storm outside. His mind reeled. Working yourself to death is enough. It wasn't. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He had prided himself on being the ultimate provider. He broke his back. He froze his hands. He sacrificed his sleep. He thought he was being a martyr for his family. But he wasn't. He was a coward. He was using the labor as a shield to hide from the agonizing work of loving a child who had lost her mother. He was giving her boots and bread, but he was starving her of a father. He was holding on to a piece of dirt, a mortgaged ranch, while the actual breathing legacy of his life was standing right in front of him, begging him to just look at her. He had bought into the frontier lie, the lie that a man's worth was measured by his sweat, by his stoicism, by the acreage he controlled. He looked past Abby. Clara was sitting at the table. She had put her mending down. She wasn't interfering. She wasn't rushing over to smooth things out or shush. She was watching Elias, expecting him to step up, expecting him to be a man, not just a worker. The ice around Elias' heart cracked. A deep, agonizing fissure. He couldn't find the words. The giant man who could break a wild stallion and fell a tree with an axe was entirely paralyzed by the truth spoken by a 7-year-old girl. He just sat there, the Winchester forgotten across his lap, as the first terrible, necessary thaw began to burn in his chest. Supper was quiet, not the dead, heavy quiet of the past 2 years. This was different. It was the quiet of a man holding his breath. Elias didn't take his plate out to the porch. He didn't retreat to the corner with his ledger or his rifle. He pulled out the heavy oak chair at the head of the table. The wood scraped loud against the floorboards. He sat down. Abby watched him. Her dark eyes tracked his every move. She held her fork suspended over her peas. Clara set a plate of sliced roasted potatoes in front of him. She didn't smile. She didn't make a grand show of his change in habit. She just poured the coffee and took her own seat. Elias picked up his fork. He looked at the food. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at his daughter. "The wind's dying down," Elias said. It was a clumsy offering, a rusty gear turning in a machine that hadn't been used in years. Abby lowered her fork. She looked at the window, then back at him. The chickens didn't like the wind. The red one hid under the trough. "She's always been a coward, that red one," Elias rumbled. It wasn't a profound conversation, but it was a conversation. Elias kept his eyes on her. It physically hurt. Looking at Abby brought the memory of Sarah rushing back. A tidal wave of grief he usually outran by working himself blind. But he forced himself to sit still. He forced himself to bear the weight of it. Because running away wasn't protecting her, it was abandoning her. The next morning, the sound of hoofbeats broke the frost-still air. Elias was chopping firewood. He buried the axe head into a thick oak stump and wiped the sweat from his brow. A lone rider trotted into the yard, Silas Mercer. The Kerrville banker was a man of 52, wearing a thick wool coat and a bowler hat that looked slightly ridiculous out in the brush. Mercer wasn't a villain. He was a father of 3 girls himself, trying to keep a bank afloat in a harsh frontier. Elias walked over to the hitching post. He didn't offer a smile. "Silas, Elias." Mercer dismounted. He patted his horse's neck, his breath plumed in the cold. He looked at the house. He saw the smoke rising steadily from the chimney. He saw the swept porch. "You found help," Mercer said. There was relief in his voice. "I did." Mercer nodded. He reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out a foreclosure notice, but the implication was heavy in the air. "We are 38 days out, Elias." "I know the calendar, Silas." Elias crossed his massive arms. "I've got 20 head of prime steers to sell next week. That'll put a dent in it." "A dent isn't the whole sum." Mercer looked at him, really looked at him. "Elias, I've known you since your father ran this land. I don't want to take this ranch, but the board in Austin is pressing hard. They see numbers, not men." Mercer sighed. He looked toward the house again. Abby was standing in the window, her small face pressed against the glass, watching them. "At what cost?" Mercer asked softly. Elias tightened his jaw. "A man keeps what's his. He provides. That's the measure of him." Mercer shook his head. He stepped closer. He didn't speak like a banker now. He spoke like an older man who had seen too many graves dug in the Texas dirt. "A real man isn't measured by the acreage he holds, Elias. He's measured by what he builds in the hearts of the people sitting at his table." Mercer pointed a gloved finger toward the window. "If you lose that little girl's childhood just to keep this dead dirt, you aren't a provider. You're the one who is truly bankrupt." The words hit Elias like the flat side of an axe blade. They echoed what Abby had said the day before. The truth was surrounding him, closing in, stripping away the lies he had told himself to survive the grief. "I'll see you in town, Silas," Elias said, his voice thick. Mercer tipped his hat. "Think on it, Elias. Pride is a poor blanket in the winter." Elias watched the banker ride away. He stood in the yard for a long time. The cold seeped through his boots, but he didn't move. When he finally walked into the house, Clara was wiping down the counter. Elias walked straight to the oak table. He picked up the heavy leather ledger, the book that held his failures, the book he never let anyone touch, because an independent rancher didn't show his bleeding wounds to strangers. He walked over to the counter. He laid the ledger down next to Clara's washcloth. Clara stopped wiping. She looked at the book. Then, she looked up at him. Elias didn't give him a speech. He didn't need to. The action spoke the truth. He was drowning. He was failing. And he was finally man enough to admit it to a woman he respected. "Look at it," Elias said quietly. "Tell me what I can't see." It was the ultimate act of intellectual surrender. He was handing over the reins. Not because he was weak, but because recognizing a partner's strength is the hallmark of true equality. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't gloat, she didn't hesitate. She opened the book. Elias stood back and watched her. Her eyes scanned the columns, her mind the clerk had ever met. She turned a page, then another. Suddenly her hand stopped. Elias watched closely. Clara's index finger was resting halfway down the right-hand page. He saw her finger tremble, just a fraction of an inch, a tiny betraying tremor. She took a slow, deep breath. The rhythm of her breathing changed. Elias stepped forward, looking over her shoulder. He looked at the entry her finger hovered over. It wasn't a massive debt. It wasn't a looming deadline. It was a date. November 1876, the month his world ended. The month Sarah took a fever and never woke up. Clara quickly turned the page. Her face was a mask of calm again. "You are bleeding money on feed," she said, her voice steady. "We can cut the winter grain by a third if we supplement with the valley grass before the frost hardens." "All right," Elias said. He didn't ask her about the trembling finger. He didn't push. But the image burned into his mind. Why did the date of his wife's death make a stranger from St. Louis shake? The attic above the main house smelled of dry dust, old pine, and forgotten things. Elias had been up here for an hour. The temperature was bitter. He was looking for his father's old iron lockbox. Silas Murph's visit had rattled him. If he had to sell off a piece of the ranch, he needed the original boundary deeds drawn up in '58. He moved a stack of canvas tarps. Beneath them sat a cedar chest, Sarah's chest. He hadn't opened it in 2 years. He knelt on the rough floorboards. The wood groaned under his weight. He stared at the brass latch. His chest felt tight, the old familiar panic rising in his throat. But he thought of Abby. He thought of his promise to be present. He couldn't hide from memories forever. He snapped the latch open. He lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and rosewater hit him. Sarah's scent. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the pain wash over him. Then he opened them. Inside were neatly folded quilts, a silverback brush, and a small stack of correspondence tied with a faded blue ribbon. Elias gently lifted the letters. He wasn't prying. He was just looking for the deeds, hoping they had been mistakenly packed away. He untied the ribbon. The letters fell into his massive hands. Most were from Sarah's sister in Ohio, but the third envelope stopped him, cold, the handwriting. It was sharp, deliberate. The ink pressed firmly into the paper. It was the exact same handwriting he had seen tacked to the mercantile board in town. Elias stared at the return address in the corner, C. Vance, St. Louis, Missouri. The postmark was stamped October 1876, 1 month before Sarah died. Elias's mind went blank. The cold of the attic vanished, replaced by a sudden rushing heat in his ears. He turned the envelope over. It had been opened. Read. Clara Vance hadn't just wandered into Kerrville. She hadn't just stumbled into Marcy's boarding house. She knew Sarah. She had written to his wife. He slid the letter out of the envelope. His large fingers felt clumsy. But the ink had run. A water spill or tears long ago had smeared the words on the page. He could make out fragments, dead piece if the time comes. Nothing whole. Nothing that made sense. He carefully folded the letter back into the envelope. He tied the blue ribbon. He put the stack back in the chest and closed the lid. He sat back on his heels in the dusty gloom. A lesser man would have stormed downstairs. A lesser man would have slammed the letter onto the kitchen table, demanded answers, and accused her of spying. He would have felt his territory was invaded. But Elias Thorne was changing. He thought about the woman downstairs. She hadn't lied to him. She said she needed work. She said she needed a quiet place. She had asked for nothing but respect, and she had given nothing but hard work and peace to his daughter. There was a secret here, a heavy one. But Elias realized something profound. Demanding a person's truth before they are ready to give it isn't honesty. It's theft. He would wait. He would let her tell him when she was ready. Later that afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. A storm was coming. Clara had asked him to help move her steamer trunk from the damp corner of her room to the interior wall away from the drafts. Elias walked into her small room off the kitchen. It was impeccably neat. A single book on the nightstand, a clean white pitcher and bowl. He gripped the leather handles of the heavy brass-bound trunk. He hoisted it effortlessly, his massive shoulders rolling with the weight. He took 2 steps across the floor. Snap! The leather handle on the right side gave way. Dry rot. The trunk hit the floor hard. The impact jarred the main brass lock. It popped open. The heavy lid bounced up, falling back against the bed frame. "I apologize," Elias said, immediately setting his end down. The leather was worn. Clara, standing by the door, took a sharp breath. She stepped forward quickly, but Elias had already seen it. Tucked into the interior webbing of the lid was a leather bank book. The impact had jolted a piece of paper loose. It fluttered down, landing face up on the top tray of folded linens. It was a bank of St. Louis. Printed clearly across the top was the name Clara M. Vance. Below it, the certified balance. 4,200. Elias stared at the number. $4,200. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy the Thorn Ranch twice over. It was enough to buy a mansion in Austin, hired a dozen servants, and live like a queen. And the woman who owned it was currently wearing a mended wool dress, scrubbing his cast-iron pots for $6 a month. Clara froze. She looked at the draft, then she looked up at Elias. Her river-stone eyes were wide, guarded, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the accusation. The silence stretched. The wind rattled the windowpane. Elias looked at the money. He looked at Clara. He didn't ask, "Why are you here?" He didn't ask, "Are you mocking me?" He understood in a flash of deep human empathy that money couldn't buy whatever it was Clara Vance was looking for. She was running from a ghost or running toward a cure. She was working herself to the bone because the physical labor kept her mind from drowning. He knew that feeling. He had lived it for 2 years. Elias reached down. His massive calloused hand gently picked up the bank draft. He didn't look at the numbers again. He handed it back to her. "I have some spare harness leather in the barn," Elias said, his voice quiet, steady, completely devoid of judgment. "I'll cut a new handle for this trunk tomorrow. Make it stronger." He didn't wait for her to explain. He didn't demand a confession. He simply closed the lid of the trunk, nodded his head respectfully, and walked out of the room. He gave her the dignity of her own secrets. It was a terrifying thing to trust a stranger who was hiding so much. But as Elias walked out into the biting wind, he realized that true partnership wasn't about knowing everything. It was about trusting what a person put on the table. Clara Vance had put hard work, respect, and kindness on his table. For now, that was enough. You can always smell a blue norther before you see it. The air goes dead flat, the birds stop singing, the smell of dust and dry pine needles hangs in the air heavy and metallic. Then the sky turns the color of a bruised plum. It was mid-February. The afternoon had been mild. By sundown, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an hour. By 8 o'clock, it was 8 degrees above zero. The wind didn't blow. It howled. It tore across the Texas hill country like a freight train off its tracks. Elias sat by the stove, lacing his heavy winter boots. His face was grim. The wind was hitting the western wall of the house so hard the floorboards vibrated. He knew what this wind meant. The western slope of the barn roof was weak. He had patched it last month, but patching wouldn't hold against this. If that roof blew off, the cold would kill the livestock. Worse, his prize heifer was due to calve, a first-time mother, dropping a calf in freezing temperatures. It was a recipe for death. He needed to be on the roof. He needed to be in the stall. He was only one man. He stood up, pulling his heavy canvas coat off the peg. He shoved his hands in thick leather gloves. He looked toward the hallway. He didn't want to ask. A man was supposed to handle the hard things. A man was supposed to face the storm alone. He turned the brass doorknob. Which one needs me more? Elias turned. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway. She wasn't wearing her apron. She was wearing a thick wool coat. A heavy woolen scarf was wrapped tight around her neck and lower face. She had a kerosene lantern in one hand, unlit, and a bucket of clean rags in the other. Elias stared at her. "You don't need to be out there. It's dangerous. I asked you a question, Elias." She didn't raise her voice, but it cut through the howling wind outside. The roof or the livestock? Elias hesitated. The old pride flared up, telling him to order her back to the fire, telling him to protect her. But he looked at her eyes. Steady. Ready. She wasn't asking for permission. She was offering reinforcement. "The heifer," Elias said, his voice dropping into a rough rumble. "Third stall on the left. She's young. She be scared. I'll handle her." Clara pulled her gloves on. Elias opened the door. The wind hit them like a physical wall of ice. They fought their way across the yard. The snow was blowing sideways, blinding them. They moved together, heads down, leaning into the gale. When they reached the barn, Elias hauled the heavy door open just enough for them to slip inside. The barn was a chaotic chorus of frightened animals. The wind screamed through the gaps in the wood. Above them, the roof groaned, a terrible tearing sound. "Go," Clara said. She lit her lantern. "I have the stall." Elias grabbed a heavy hammer, a canvas sack of iron nails, and a coil of rope. He went out the back door and climbed the icy rungs of the exterior ladder. The roof was a nightmare. The wind threatened to rip him off the shingles and throw him into the frozen dirt. He tied the rope to the weather-vane base, wrapped the other end around his waist, and crawled toward the western slope. For 2 hours, the world was nothing but ice, wind, and iron. He pounded nails into the buckling wood. His fingers went numb. Then they started to burn. Then they stopped feeling anything at all. He swung the hammer blindly in the dark, fighting the sky itself. Every time the wind tried to tear the roof away, Elias hammered it back down. Through the cracks in the shingles, he could see the amber glow of Clara's lantern in the third stall. He saw her kneeling in the freezing straw. He saw her taking off her coat to wrap it around the shivering flanks of the mother cow. He couldn't hear her over the wind, but he could see her mouth moving, talking to the animal, calming her. Elias swung the hammer. He wasn't alone. For the first time in 2 years, he was fighting a war with someone watching his flank. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the wind finally broke. It didn't stop, but the screaming howl faded into a steady, bitter blow. The roof was secured. Elias untied the rope. His body was stiff, shaking violently from the cold. He climbed down the ladder and stumbled into the barn. He walked over to the third stall. Clara was sitting on a turned-over bucket. Her hair had escaped its tight bun, hanging in damp, freezing strands around her face. Her hands were covered in dried blood and afterbirth. Lying in the straw next to the exhausted mother was a wet, shivering black and white calf. Alive, breathing. Clara looked up. She looked completely spent, but her eyes caught the light of the lantern, bright and fiercely proud. "A bull calf," Clara said quietly. Elias looked at the calf. He looked at Clara. He took off his glove. His right hand was covered in blood. He had missed the nail in the dark, smashed index finger square on the knuckle. "Let's go." "Inside," Elias said. 3 in the morning. The kitchen was warm. The iron stove radiated a steady, saving heat. They sat at the kitchen table. They hadn't changed their clothes yet. They were too tired to stand. Clara came out of the pantry. She had a bottle of Elias' cheap rye whiskey, a basin of hot water, and a strip of clean white linen. She sat down opposite him. "Give me your hand," she said. Elias laid his massive, battered hand on the table. The index finger was a mess. Purple, swollen to twice its size, the nail split down the middle. Clara, she didn't ask if it hurt. She knew it hurt. She poured a splash of the whiskey directly over the open cut. Elias didn't flinch. His jaw locked. Clara took the hot, wet cloth and wiped the grime and dried blood away. Her touch was incredibly gentle, contrasting sharply with the brutal weather they had just fought. She worked in total silence. She wrapped the linen strip tight, tying it off with a swift, practiced knot. "Keep it elevated tonight," she said. She pushed the bottle of whiskey toward him. "Drink the rest." Elias took the bottle. He took a long, burning swallow. He set it down. He looked at her, really looked at her. The dirt smudged on her cheek, the exhaustion lining her eyes. "I always thought a man had to stand in the storm alone," Elias said. His voice was rough, gravelly from the cold. "I thought my job was to take the beating so the house wouldn't fall, to keep the sky from crushing my family." Clara met his gaze. She didn't interrupt. "Tonight, you showed me something. You showed me a woman can hold up the sky just fine." He didn't call her his cook. He didn't call her his housekeeper. He leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, partner." Clara's hands paused on the table. The word hung between them. Partner. It wasn't a word used lightly on the frontier. It meant absolute trust. It meant standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud and the blood. She didn't smile. A smile would have made it small. She gave him a single, solemn nod. "You're welcome, Elias." They sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the wind die down outside. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the profound, quiet respect of two people who had faced the dark together and held their ground. The morning sun off the fresh snow was blinding. 3 days had passed since the blue norther. The roof held. The calf lived. Elias' finger throbbed with a dull, constant ache, but it was healing. Everything should have felt like a victory. But Silas Mercer was riding up the driveway again. Elias met him on the porch. The banker didn't beat around the bush. "I have a buyer, Elias," Mercer said. He kept his voice low, respectful but firm. "A railroad surveyor from Austin. He wants the east pasture, 280 acres. He is willing to pay a premium because of the river access." Elias went rigid. "The east pasture is my father's land. It's where the original cabin stood." "It's land you don't graze anymore," Mercer countered smoothly. "Elias, listen to me. The offer is generous. It covers the entire note, every penny. You sell that piece, and you keep the main house, the barns, and 900 acres, free and clear. No bank, no mortgage, no deadlines." Elias looked out towards the eastern horizon. He could see the tops of the old pecan trees his father had planted. Selling it felt like cutting off his own arm. It felt like admitting defeat. "I need an answer by the end of the week," Mercer said gently. He tipped his hat and rode away. Elias stood on the porch. The cold felt different today. It felt hollow. He turned and walked into the house. Clara was at the kitchen table peeling potatoes. Abby was in her room reading a primer. Elias walked over to the stove. He poured a cup of coffee. He didn't drink it. He held the tin cup, feeling the heat against his good hand. He looked at Clara. He thought about partnership. He thought about the trust they had forged in the barn. He couldn't carry this alone anymore. But before he could ask her for advice, he needed the rest of the truth. He couldn't build a future on a floorboard with a rot hiding underneath. "Clara," Elias said. His voice was quiet. She slipped immediately. She stopped peeling. She didn't look on a towel. Yes? Elias, set the cup down. When I was in the attic last week, looking for the deeds, I found a chest. Clara went perfectly still. I found a letter, Elias continued. He didn't sound angry, he sounded exhausted. Sent to Sarah, from St. Louis, October 1876. Clara slowly laid the paring knife on the table. The metallic clink was the only sound in the room. She finally looked up. Her Riverstone eyes were wide, but she didn't shrink away. She didn't try to lie. You read it, she said. No, water got to it. The ink was ruined. Elias stepped closer to the and the bag of ink draft in your trunk. He paused. He took a slow breath. I need you to tell me why a woman with $4,000 in the bank wrote a letter to my dead wife and then came here to scrub my floors. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, agonizing thing. Clara looked down at her hands. Then she squared her shoulders. She lifted her chin. She was going to give it to him straight. My husband was Nathaniel Vance, Clara said. Her voice was steady but tight. He was a merchant, a good man but a weak businessman. In the late 60s, before you took over this ranch, Nathaniel did a cattle deal with your father. It went bad. Nathaniel walked away owing your family $800. Elias frowned. My father never mentioned a Vance because your father wrote it off. But Nathaniel couldn't. It ate him. The guilt of it poisoned his pride. He carried that debt like a stone around his neck until the day his heart gave out. Clara swallowed hard. He died in November of 1876. Elias flinched. The exact same month. When we settled his estate, Clara continued, I found the journals. I found the debt. I had the money. So I wrote to your wife. I wanted to send a bank draft to clear Nathaniel's ledger. I wanted to buy my peace. Elias stared at her. You came here to pay a debt? That doesn't make sense. You could have just mailed the draft to the bank. I tried. Clara softly. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. Sarah wrote me back. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. Sarah wrote to you. Yes. Clara reached into her apron pocket. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. She laid it on the table and pushed it toward Elias. Elias didn't touch it. He recognized Sarah's elegant, sweeping handwriting instantly. She refused the money, Clara said. Her voice cracked just once. She told me the debt was forgiven before I was even born. Clara looked Elias dead in the eye. The educational weight of her next words struck him like a physical blow. But she wrote something else, Elias. She wrote, never use your money to pay for the sins of dead men. Women have the right to breathe, to start over, and to walk with their heads held high. Do not let his guilt become your prison. If St. Louis suffocates you, Kerrville has room for a free woman. Clara wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. I didn't come here to pay a debt, Elias. I came here because your wife gave me permission to live again. I came here to start over on my own terms, to earn my keep with my own hands. I answered your notice because it was her house. Elias stood frozen. The truth was laid bare. There was no malice. There was no grand conspiracy. But it cut him deeper than any lie could have. Sarah had known. In her final days, while Elias was out in the fields breaking his back, Sarah was writing letters to a widow in St. Louis. Sarah had seen the crushing weight of the world, and her instinct was to offer grace. And she had never told him. Elias felt a terrifying hollow ache open up in his chest. Sarah hadn't trusted him with this. She had looked at her giant, stoic husband, the man who provided everything, and realized he couldn't handle the emotional weight of a stranger's pain. So she handled it herself. She had invited Clara. Sarah had set the pieces on the board before she died, knowing Elias would eventually break under the silence. She had sent him a partner because she knew he was failing as a father. It was a profound act of love and a devastating indictment of his emotional absence. Elias backed away from the table. He couldn't look at Clara. He couldn't look at the letter. Elias, Clara said softly, stepping forward, don't. He held up his hand. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse her of anything. He was just a man who had suddenly realized he had been entirely sidelined in his own tragedy. He turned and walked out the back door, stepping into the freezing glare of the snowy yard. Inside the kitchen, Clara stood alone. She looked at the letter on the table. She had finally told the truth. But the truth is a cruel knife. It cuts out the infection, but you still have to bleed. The partnership they had forged in the storm was fracturing. Not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of the ghosts standing between them. 3 days passed. 3 days of heavy, suffocating silence. Elias and Clara worked side by side, but a canyon had opened between them. It wasn't anger. It was the crushing weight of things left unsaid. Elias spent his days out in the freezing mud, fixing fences that didn't need fixing. Clara stayed in the house, scrubbing floors that were already clean. They were two people retreating to their corners, hiding in the labor. It was Thursday afternoon. Elias came inside to warm his hands. The wind was picking up again. He took off his hat and hung it on the peg. He walked into the kitchen. Clara wasn't there. She had gone out to the smokehouse to check the meat. Abby was there. The little girl had a broom in her hands. It was too tall for her. She was sweeping the floor near the small bookshelf Clara had set up in the corner. Abby swung the broom handle a little too wide. The wooden handle bumped the shelf. A small leather-bound book tumbled off the edge. It hit the floorboards, landing face down. The pages splayed open. "I'll get it, Papa," Abby said quickly. She dropped the broom. She scrambled to pick up the book, afraid she had broken a rule. Alika stepped forward. "It's all right, Abby. Let me." He knelt down, his massive nose popped. He reached out with his bandaged hand and picked up the book. It was Clara's journal. He didn't mean to pry. He was a man who respected boundaries. He started to close it, but the handwriting caught his eye. It was that same sharp, deliberate script. And the words on the open page weren't a daily log of chores. They weren't a grocery list. Elias stopped. He read the first 3 lines. 5 pregnancies, 5 miscarriages. "I didn't come to Texas to pay a debt. I came because I needed a house with a child's heartbeat in it. I came so I could remember how to live." Elias stopped breathing. The air in the kitchen vanished. He stared at the blue ink, the letters blurred. He read the words again. 5 miscarriages. He thought about the bank draft in Clara's trunk. $4,200. He thought about her mended dress. He thought about the way she looked at Abby when the girl wasn't paying attention. A look of quiet, desperate reverence. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Clara Vance wasn't a rich widow playing at Pioneer Life. She wasn't an angel sent by Sarah to save his ranch. She was a mother with empty arms. She was drowning, just like him. But there was a profound difference. Elias had a living, breathing child in his house, and he ignored her to mourn the dead. Clara had lost everything, and she crossed the country just to be near a child she couldn't even call her own. She was working her fingers to the bone just to earn the right to sit at a table where a little girl ate her supper. Elias closed the book. Gently, he placed it back on the shelf. He stood up. He looked down at his calloused hands. He had been so blind, so wrapped up in his own stoic pride. He thought providing meant suffering and silence. He thought suffering was the measure of a man. He was wrong. Elias walked over to Abby. The little girl was standing very still, watching him. He didn't say a word. He just placed his giant hand on top of her head. He let it rest there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out the door. He didn't go to the barn to fix fences. He saddled his gelding. He pulled the cinch tight. He swung his heavy frame into the saddle and turned the horse toward Kerrville. He rode hard. The cold wind whipped his face, but he didn't feel it. For the first time in 2 years, his mind was absolutely clear. He rode into town and tied his horse outside the bank. He didn't wipe the mud off his boots. He walked straight through the heavy oak doors. Silas Mercer was sitting behind his desk. He looked up, surprised. "Elias, I didn't expect you until tomorrow." Elias walked up to the desk. He didn't sit down. "The East Pasture," Elias said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. 280 acres. The offer still stands?" Mercer blinked. He set his pen down carefully. "It does. The surveyor from Austin left the paperwork with me. But Elias, you need to be sure. That's your father's original claim." "My father is dead," Elias said flatly. "And I have a daughter who is very much alive." Mercer studied him. The older man saw the shift. The rigid, frozen pride that had encased Elias Thorne for 2 years was gone. In its place was something stronger, something real. Mercer opened his drawer. He pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He laid them on the desk. He dipped a steel pen in the inkwell and offered it to Elias. "Sign the bottom line," Mercer said quietly. "And the note is paid in full. The rest of the Thorne Ranch belongs to you." Free and clear, Elias took the pen. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He pressed the nib to the paper and signed his name. The scratch of the pen sounded like a chain breaking in the quiet room. It was done. He had sold a piece of his history. He had sold the soil his father sweat over. But as he handed the pen back to Mercer, Elias didn't feel defeat. He felt a massive, crushing weight lift off his chest. Land was just dirt. Dirt doesn't love you back. Dirt doesn't cry when you ignore it. He shook Mercer's hand. He walked out of the bank. It was dark when Elias returned. The wind howled, but the main house was glowing with lantern light. He unsaddled the horse, fed the stock, and walked to the back door. He stepped inside. He took off his coat. Clara was at the stove. Abby was sitting on the rug by the fireplace, playing with a set of wooden blocks Elias had carved for her years ago. Elias walked into the parlor. He didn't go to his corner. He didn't pick up his rifle or his ledger. He walked straight to the braided rug. He sat down heavily in the armchair nearest the fire. "Abby!" Elias said. The little girl looked up. Her dark eyes were wide, cautious. "Come here," he said softly. Abby stood up. She walked over to him slowly. She stopped a foot away. Elias reached out. He put his massive hands on her small waist, and he lifted her up. He pulled her onto his lap. He hadn't done this since Sarah died. He hadn't held her. Abby went perfectly stiff for a second. Then slowly she relaxed. She rested her head against his broad chest. Elias looked down at her. He felt a hot, burning tear slide down his weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "You were right, Abby," Elias said, his voice cracked. He didn't try to hide it. "You were right that day. I was wrong." Abby looked up at him. From the kitchen doorway, Clara stood perfectly still. She was watching them, a dish towel gripped tightly in her hands. "I thought doing the work was enough," Elias said, looking directly into his daughter's eyes. "I thought putting a roof over your head and bringing meat into this house made me a father. I thought if I just worked hard enough, it would keep the sadness away. But it didn't keep it away. It just left you all alone in the dark." He wrapped his thick arms around her. "Careful, gentle. A real dad doesn't just put bread on the table," Elias said. The words were a vow, an education in what it meant to be a man. "A real dad puts his heart on the table. He puts his time there, and I haven't done that." "I am so sorry, little bird." Abby's bottom lip quivered. She didn't say a word. She just buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt. She wrapped her small arms around his neck and she cried. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the loud, desperate, racking sobs of a child who had been holding her breath for 2 years. Elias held her. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He let her cry until his shirt was soaked. He held her until the fire burned down to glowing embers. He looked up. Clara was still standing in the doorway. Tears were streaming silently down her own face, but she was smiling. A soft, radiant, heartbreaking smile. Elias nodded to her, just once. The ice was completely gone. The giant had finally thawed. The house felt different the next morning. It wasn't just the quiet after the storm. The very air in the rooms had changed. The suffocating pressure of unpayable debt was gone. The heavy, dark cloud of unspoken grief had broken. Elias woke up early. He didn't rush out to the barn. He walked into the kitchen. The sun wasn't up yet. Clara was already there, lighting the stove. She turned when she heard his heavy boots on the floorboards. Elias walked over to the table. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy watermarked paper. He laid it on the center of the oak table. Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. "What is that?" she asked. "That is the release of mortgage," Elias said. His voice was calm, steady. "I rode into Kerrville yesterday. I sold the east pasture to a surveyor. The note is paid. The bank has no claim on this land." Clara stared at him. Her Riverstone eyes widened. "You sold your father's land?" "I sold dirt," Elias corrected her gently, "to save the things that actually breathe." He stepped closer to the table. He didn't crowd her. He gave her space. "I know why you came here, Clara," Elias said. Flinched, she looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I saw the journal," Elias said softly. "I didn't mean to." Abby knocked it down. "I saw the first page." Clara closed her eyes. A shudder ran through her shoulders. She prepared herself for the pity. She prepared herself for him to tell her she was broken. "You don't have to hide it," Elias said. "You don't have to carry it alone in this house." Clara looked up. There was no pity in his eyes. Only a deep, profound respect. "The ranch is free and clear," Elias continued. He pointed to the paper on the table. I owe no man, which means I don't need a hired hand to save me from ruin anymore." He looked her straight. Was the moment. The frontier was full of men who demanded things, men who bought wives with land and cattle. Elias Thorne was choosing a path. "I will not pay out of obligation," Elias said. His words were measured, rhythmic. "I will not ask you to stay because we need a cook. You have your own money. You have your own life. If you pack your trunk today and go back to St. Louis or go anywhere else, I will hit myself and wish you a safe road." He paused, but he let the silence sit between them. "But," Elias said, his voice dropping lower, "if you stay, I want you to stay because you choose this place. I want you to stay as a woman who owns her own life. Not as a worker. Not to pay a ghostess debt. But because you want to sit at this table with us." It was a statement of absolute equality. He wasn't begging her to fix his broken heart. He wasn't demanding she fill the role of a mother. He was offering her the one thing she had never truly had since Nathaniel died: agency. Love, Elias had realized, wasn't just a feeling. Feelings change. Feelings fade. True love was a choice, a deliberate daily choice made by two free equals. Clara looked at the giant rancher. She looked at the deed on the table. She didn't cry. She didn't throw herself into his arms. That wasn't who she was. She stood up straight. She looked at him with an expression of fierce, quiet dignity. "I hear you, Elias," Clara said. "Take your time," Elias replied. He picked up his hat. "I have chores." He walked out the door. He didn't look back. He left the choice entirely in her hands. The day passed. Elias worked in the barn. He fixed the harness. He fed the calf. He didn't go back to the house for the midday meal. He stayed outside, giving her the space to pack, giving her the room to leave. It was the hardest day of work he had ever put in. Every time he heard a sound from the yard, his chest tightened. He expected to hear the creak of wagon wheels. He expected to walk in and the house empty. Night fell. The air turned bitterly cold. Elias finally walked back to the house. He stomped the snow off his boots. He opened the door. The kitchen was warm. The smell of roasted chicken and sage filled the air. Clara was setting the table. 3 plates, 3 forks. She didn't look up when he walked in. She just kept setting the table. Her trunk was nowhere in sight. Elias took off his hat. He hung his coat. He walked to the wash basin and scrubbed his hands. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but he kept his face calm. He walked over to the table. He sat down. Abby came running out of her room. She climbed into her chair. She looked at Elias, then looked at Clara. A bright, knowing smile spread across her face. Clara brought the heavy iron skillet to the table. She served Abby. She served Elias. She sat down. They ate in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the past. It was a comfortable, living quiet, the quiet of people who didn't need words to understand each other. The next morning, 5 o'clock. The sky was pitch black. Elias walked into the kitchen. The stove was already hot. Clara was standing by the counter. She had a tin cup in her hand. Steam rose from the dark coffee. She turned around. She looked at him. She didn't say a word. She walked over to him. She held out the cup. Elias reached out, his massive scarred hand wrapped around the tin. As he took it, his thick fingers brushed against hers. He didn't pull away. Clara didn't pull away. For 3 seconds, their hands rested together against the warm metal. A silent vow, a choice made, a contract renewed, not in ink, but in shared warmth. Clara finally let go of the cup. She looked up into his eyes. "The coffee is hot," she said softly. "I like it hot." Elias replied. He took a sip. He stood it. He watched her turn back to the stove and knew with absolute certainty that the winter was finally over. The choice had been made. And it was enough. Late March brought the thaw. The frost melted into the dark Texas dirt. The creeks ran high. The air smelled of wet pine and blooming bluebonnets. Elias was back in the attic. He wasn't hiding this time. He had a crowbar in his hand. He was tearing out the old floorboards to run a stovepipe up to the loft. He was building Abby a proper bedroom, a room with a window facing the sunrise. He pried up a stubborn piece of oak. The wood splintered with a loud crack. Beneath the board, resting in the dry dust between the joists, was a box. It was a small iron lockbox, rusted shut, covered in decades of grime. Elias wiped the sweat from his forehead. He set the crowbar down. He reached into the gap and pulled the box free. He recognized it. It belonged to his father, James Thorne. Elias carried the heavy iron box over to the small gable window. The morning light caught the rust. He took a flathead chisel from his belt and wedged it under the lock. He brought the heel of his hand down hard. The brittle metal snapped. The lid creaked open. Elias expected to find old boundary surveys, forgotten deeds, maybe a handful of silver dollars. He found a stack of letters. They were bound in a piece of dried leather twine. The paper was yellowed, crisp with age. Elias untied the leather. He opened the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, loops of faded black ink. The date at the top read May 14, 1858. It was addressed to his father, but it wasn't from Elias' mother. It was signed Mary. Elias sat on an overturned crate. He the first letter, then the third. The story unfolded in the quiet dust of the attic, a ghost story, a tragedy of the frontier. Mary was a woman from the neighboring settlement. She and James Thorne had been deeply in love. They had planned to marry. They had planned to build this very ranch together. Then came the dispute. Mary's family claimed the east pasture, the 280 acres by the river. James Thorne's father claimed it too. It went to the courts. The families turned bitter. The town drew lines. Mary begged James to let the land go. She begged him to walk away from the dirt so they could keep each other. James Thorne refused. He fought for the land. He won the court case. He kept the east pasture. The final letter from Mary was short, devastating. "You won your dirt, James, but dirt cannot hold your hand in the dark. You chose the acreage over our life. Keep your land. I am leaving for Galveston in the morning." Elias stared at the faded ink. His chest felt tight. He looked out the small attic window. He looked toward the east. The trees were greening along the river, the 280 acres he had just sold to the surveyor from Austin. History had tried to trap him. The east pasture had broken his father's heart. It had turned his father into a hard, unforgiving man who valued property over people. The land had demanded a sacrifice, and 2 months ago, the land had demanded the same sacrifice from Elias. It demanded he sacrifice Abby's childhood. It demanded he sacrifice his own soul just to keep the map intact. Elias closed his eyes. He had broken the chain. He had sold the cursed ground. He hadn't lost his legacy. He had finally saved it. Elias took the letters downstairs. He walked into the kitchen. Clara was rolling out pie crust on the floured counter. She looked up when he entered. She saw the iron box. She saw the look on his face. She wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it, Elias?" He set the letters on the table. "My father's ghosts." Clara walked over. She stood beside him. She read the top letter. She didn't gasp. She didn't make a sound. She read the tragedy of James Thorne in silence. When she finished, she looked at Elias. Her Riverstone eyes were bright. "He chose the land," Clara said softly. "He did," Elias rumbled. "He kept his pride, he kept his pasture, and he died a very cold man." Elias turned to face her. The giant rancher didn't drop to one knee. He didn't offer a ring or a dramatic speech. He simply stood before her as a man who had finally learned what mattered. "I am not my father," Elias said. The words were steady, absolute. "I sold the dirt. I would sell the rest of it tomorrow if it meant keeping the peace in this house. Land is just dirt, Clara. People are the legacy." Clara looked at him. A quiet, profound understanding passed between them. "You need a wife?" Clara said softly, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "No," Elias corrected her. He reached out and gently took her flour-dusted hand. "I need a partner. Abby needs a mother. And I think you need a place where your heart can finally rest." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "I do," she whispered. "Then let's go to town," Elias said. Mid-April. The Kerrville courthouse was small, built of pale limestone. The wooden benches in the back were empty. It was a Tuesday. They didn't want a spectacle. They didn't need a crowd. Elias wore his best dark suit. It was brushed clean of dust. Clara didn't wear a white gown. She wore a deep blue wool dress, simple and elegant. Her dark hair was pinned up, but a few loose strands framed her face. She looked beautiful. She looked real. Abby stood right between them. The little girl wore a new yellow dress Clara had made for her. She held Elias's massive left hand. She held Clara's right hand. She anchored them together. Judge Hopkins stood behind his heavy oak desk. He opened a worn leather Bible. He cleared his throat. "We are gathered here to join Elias Thorne and Clara Vance in holy matrimony," the judge began. His voice echoed in the empty room. He went through the standard readings, the frontier rituals. Then he looked at Clara. "Do you, Clara Vance, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, to love, honor, and obey him, so long as you both shall live," Elias said. The word rang out deep and sharp. Judge Hopkins stopped. He lowered the Bible. He looked at Elias over his spectacles. "So, is there a problem, Mr. Thorne?" Elias looked at Clara. Then he looked at the judge. "Skip the word obey." "Elias," said the judge, frowned. "Elias, that's the standard vow. It's the tradition of the church. The wife obeys the husband. He provides, she submits. That's the law of the frontier." "Not in my house," Elias said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his tone filled the room. "A man who demands obedience doesn't want a wife. He wants a servant," Elias stated, his words slow and deliberate. He looked down at Abby, then back up to the judge. "I am marrying my equal. We don't submit. We stand shoulder to shoulder. Cross out obey." Judge Hopkins blinked. He looked at Clara. Clara was looking at Elias. Her eyes were shining. The respect in her gaze was absolute. "What would you like me to replace it with, Mr. Thorne?" the judge asked, a little flustered. As Clara spoke up. Her voice was clear as a bell. "To love, honor, and respect, and to share the burden." The judge sighed. He picked up a pencil. He crossed out a line in his book. He scribbled in the margin. "Very well," the judge said. He adjusted his glasses. "To love, honor, respect, and share the burden, do you?" "I do," Clara said. "I do," Elias said. There was no grand kiss, no cheering crowd, just a quiet, unbreakable contract forged between two equals. They walked out of the courthouse holding hands. They stepped into the bright spring sunlight. A family chosen, built on truth, not tradition. It was a Tuesday morning, 4:47 in the morning. The air was mild. The birds were just starting to wake up in the pecan trees. Elias Thorne swung the hammer. It was the same heavy iron hammer he had used in the freezing dark months ago. But today, it didn't look like a weapon of desperation. It looked like a tool of creation. He drove a thick square nail into the new pine siding of the house. He was finishing the exterior wall of Abby Ent's new bedroom. The wood smelled sharp and fresh. He swung again. The iron hit the nail clean. True hammer didn't feel heavy anymore. His shoulders didn't ache. The suffocating weight on his chest was completely gone. The ghosts had finally left the Thorne Ranch. The back door of the main house creaked open. Elias stopped hammering. He lowered his arm. He turned around. Abby came bounding out onto the porch. Her nightgown trailed behind her. Her feet were bare. Her hair was a messy tangle of dark curls. She ran across the damp grass. She didn't hesitate. She didn't hover on the edge of the light. She ran straight to her giant father. Elias dropped the hammer. He caught her by the waist and swung her up into his arms. Abby laughed. It was a bright, clear sound. The sound a child is supposed to make. She wrapped her arms around his thick, and squeezed tight. "Is my room done, Papa?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Almost, little bird." Elias smiled. It was a real smile. It reached all the way to his eyes. "Just putting the final touches on the window frame so you can see the sun come up." The porch door opened wider. Clara stepped out. She wore a simple cotton dress. A shawl was draped loosely over her shoulders against the morning chill. She held 2 tin cups in her hands. Steam curled up from the dark, hot coffee. She walked across the grass. She stopped beside them. Elias shifted Abby to his left arm. He reached out with his right hand and took the cup from Clara. "Good morning," Clara said softly. "Good morning," Elias replied. He looked at the woman standing beside him. He looked at the little girl resting her head on his shoulder. He looked out past the barn. He looked toward the east. The horizon was turning a soft, glowing pink. The 280 acres were gone. The debt was gone. The silence was gone. The land doesn't hold you. It never did. A man is only held by the people he chooses to love, and the people who choose to love him back. Elias took a sip of the hot coffee. He pulled his family close. He watched the sun rise over Texas, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to work. He just felt the need to live. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
And so the Thorn Ranch fell quiet. Not the cold, hollow quiet of a man hiding from his own grief, but the warm, breathing quiet of a home that had finally been filled. Elias Thorne spent 2 years believing that the measure of a man was the weight of iron in his hands, the frost on his knuckles, and the acres he could hold against a merciless world. He believed that if he worked hard enough, long enough, and suffered silently enough, he would be doing his duty. He was wrong, and it took a 7-year-old girl, a widow with riverstone eyes, and one small scorched pot of oatmeal to show him the truth he had been running from every single morning before the sun came up. The first lesson this story teaches us is one the frontier never liked to admit: providing is not the same as loving. A man can put a roof over a child's head and still leave her standing alone in the cold, holding up a piece of stitched canvas, waiting for someone, anyone, to simply look at her. Elias gave Abby bread and boots in silence. What she needed was his eyes on her face. What she needed was to know she was worth more than the cattle, more than the banknote, more than the frozen ground. And the moment he finally sat down on that braided rug and pulled her into his arms, the whole ranch changed. Not because the debt was paid, not because the storm was over, but because a father finally put his heart on the table. The second lesson lives in Clara Vance. She walked into a broken man's house, not as a servant, not as a charity case, but as an equal, and she refused, quietly and absolutely, to be treated as anything less. She reminds us that dignity is not something you earn with money or land. It is something you carry in the set of your jaw and the steadiness of your eyes. She teaches us that 2 people can hold each other up without either one kneeling down. That true partnership is built not on what one person can offer the other, but on the shared willingness to stand in the mud together when the storm comes. And perhaps the deepest lesson of all is the one buried in that old iron lockbox in the attic. James Thorne chose his dirt. He won his pasture and lost his love and died a cold, hard man. Elias almost made the same choice, but he didn't. He signed his name, sold the cursed ground, and walked out of that bank lighter than he had been in years. Because he had finally understood what his father never could. The land does not remember you. The land does not grieve you. The land does not laugh when your little girl runs barefoot across the morning grass. Only people do that. Only the ones you choose to love and who choose to love you back. That is the true legacy of the Thorne Ranch. Not the acreage, not the cattle, not the limestone and the river and the pecan trees greening in the spring. The legacy is a little girl with dark curls who finally knows her father sees her. The legacy is a woman who crossed the country to find a house where her heart could rest, and found it. The legacy is a man who learned, just in time, that the bravest thing a person can ever do is not to face the storm alone, but to open the door and let someone face it with you. Some of us are Elias. We work and we sacrifice and we tell ourselves that suffering is the same as loving. Some of us are Clara, carrying a quiet, private grief, looking for a place where we are allowed to begin again. And some of us are Abby, standing at the edge of someone's distracted world, holding out a small, imperfect thing we made with our own hands, hoping with everything we have that someone will stop and look and say, "I see you." This story is for all of us. May we be wise enough to put the hammer down. May we be brave enough to sit by the fire. And may we always, always choose the people over the dirt.